In 1930, a fur trapper named Joe Labelle snowshoed into an Inuit village on the shores of Angikuni Lake in northern Canada. He had been to this village before. He knew the families. He had traded with them, eaten with them, slept near their fires. But when he arrived this time, there was no smoke rising from the dwellings, no children playing, no dogs barking, no sound at all. Every single person in the village was gone. Food was still hanging over fires that had burned down to cold ash. Kayaks, the only way to travel across the lake, were still sitting on the shore, and the sled dogs, the most valuable survival tool in the Arctic, were found dead, still tied to trees, starved to death. An entire community had vanished. No footprints leading out, no signs of a struggle, no explanation. And more than 90 years later, we still don't have one. Andrew here, for Permanent Underclass, where we explore the weird stuff your therapist would tell you to avoid. The "oh cool, now I'll never sleep again" side of reality. If you're easily scared, easily offended, or easily anything, you're in the wrong place. To understand why this case is so disturbing, you need to understand where Angikuni Lake is and what it meant to live there. Angikuni sits in the Kivalik region of what is now Nunavut, deep in the Canadian Arctic. This is not a place you stumble into. It is hundreds of miles from the nearest town. In the 1930s, it was accessible only by dog sled, canoe, or on foot. There were no roads, there were no airstrips. The nearest telegraph station was a grueling journey away. The Inuit communities in this region had lived on these lands for generations. They weren't just surviving, they had mastered survival. Every aspect of their daily life was built around enduring one of the harshest environments on the planet. Temperatures that could drop to 60 below. Darkness that lasted months. Winds that could bury a camp in snow in a matter of hours. The people who lived at Angikuni Lake didn't just know how to survive out there. They were among the only people on Earth who could. That is what makes the idea of them simply leaving, abandoning their food, their kayaks, their dogs, their clothing, so fundamentally impossible to accept. You don't do that. Not there. Not if you want to live. Joe Labelle understood this. He was a seasoned fur trapper who had spent years working the northern territories. He was not a man easily unsettled. He was not prone to exaggeration about the wilderness. He knew what a normal village looked like, and he knew what he was seeing was anything but normal. Let's walk through exactly what Labelle reported when he entered that village, because the details are what make this case so difficult to dismiss. He arrived in the late afternoon. The first thing he noticed was the silence. In a functioning Inuit village, there is always sound, dogs barking, children, the crack of wood being split, conversation carrying across the cold air. At Angikuni, there was nothing, just wind. He approached the first dwelling and called out. No response. He pushed open the entrance and looked inside. Everything was in place. Tools were where they should be. Sleeping areas were laid out as if someone had simply gotten up and walked away. There was food, partially prepared meals left in the middle of being made, pots that had been set over fires, but the fires had burned themselves out long ago. The food was untouched. Nobody had eaten. He moved to the next dwelling. Same thing. And the next. Every single home in the village told the same story. People had been in the middle of their daily routines, and then, at some point, they stopped. They didn't pack. They didn't prepare. They didn't take the things you absolutely must take if you're going anywhere in the Arctic. They just stopped what they were doing and were gone. Labelle checked the food stores. Full. The village's reserves, which would have been carefully managed and rationed for the harsh months, were intact. Nobody fleeing famine leaves their food behind. Nobody migrating to follow caribou leaves their food behind. That food was life itself, and it was sitting there untouched. He checked the kayaks, all still on the shore. Kayaks were the primary method of summer travel across the lake and through the waterways. Without them, you aren't going anywhere quickly. They were all accounted for. Wherever these people went, they didn't go by water. And then there was the clothing. Labelle found heavy outer garments, parkas, boots, left inside the dwellings. In the Arctic, your clothing is your survival system. Your parka is the difference between life and death. You do not go outside without it. You certainly don't leave a village without it, but there they were, left behind, as if the people who wore them had simply ceased to need them. And then Labelle found the dogs. Sled dogs in an Inuit community are not pets. They are essential. They pull your sleds across the ice. They warn you of approaching predators. They are, in many cases, the reason you make it through winter. A team of sled dogs was one of the most valuable things a family could own. Labelle found several dogs at the perimeter of the village, still tethered to trees and posts. They were dead. They had starved. Their leads were still attached. Nobody had untied them. Nobody had fed them. Nobody had come back for them. Think about what that means. Whatever caused these people to leave, it happened in a way that made them abandon the animals they depended on for survival. They didn't release them to fend for themselves, which would have been a small mercy and taken only seconds. They didn't take them along, which is what you would do in any planned departure. They left them tied up to die slowly. That detail, more than any other, has haunted researchers for decades. It suggests something sudden, something that didn't allow for any preparation, any decision-making, any rational response at all. But the detail that transforms this from a strange disappearance into something truly inexplicable is what Labelle found at the burial grounds. The village, like most Inuit communities, had a designated area where the dead were buried. Labelle walked to this area and found that the graves had been opened. Stones that had been carefully placed over burial sites had been moved. The ground had been dug into, and the bodies that had been buried there were gone. Now you need to understand what that means in practical terms. The ground in the Kayaks region is permafrost, permanently frozen soil that can extend hundreds of feet deep. Digging into permafrost is extraordinarily difficult even with modern equipment. In the 1930s, without heavy machinery, excavating a grave from permafrost would have been a massive undertaking requiring significant time, manpower, and motivation. And yet the graves were open. The bodies were removed. There was no indication of who had done it or why. This detail eliminates several of the simpler explanations for the village's abandonment. If the people had migrated, why would they dig up their dead and take the bodies with them? Inuit tradition held deep respect for burial sites, and disturbing them was not something done casually. If an outside force had relocated the village, why would they bother with the burial grounds? If disease had driven the people away, the last thing they would do is dig up old graves and expose themselves to further contamination. The open graves don't fit any conventional explanation. They suggest something operating outside the logic of anything we understand. After documenting what he'd seen, Labelle traveled to the nearest telegraph station and sent word to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The RCMP dispatched investigators to the site. What happened next is where the historical record gets murky and where the controversy around this case really begins. According to some accounts, the RCMP officers who arrived at Angikuni confirmed what Labelle had described: an empty village with no signs of where the inhabitants had gone. They reportedly conducted a search of the surrounding area and found no tracks, no camps, no evidence of the villagers anywhere in the region. However, the official RCMP records tell a somewhat different story. A report from 1931 suggests that investigators interviewed trappers and traders in the area and determined that the village had likely been abandoned gradually over a period of time, not all at once. The report characterizes Labelle's account as exaggerated and suggests that the more dramatic elements, the opened graves, the starved dogs, were either embellishments or misinterpretations. But here's the problem with dismissing the case based on the RCMP report. In the 1930s, the RCMP's investigations into events affecting indigenous communities were frequently perfunctory. Resources were minimal. Interest was low. The institutional attitude toward the Inuit and other indigenous peoples was, at best, dismissive. A report that says, "Nothing to see here," from that era and that context doesn't carry the same weight it might from a modern, well-funded investigation. There is also the question of what the RCMP was actually able to investigate. By the time officers reached the remote lake, weeks or possibly months had passed since Labelle's discovery. Weather could have erased tracks. Animals could have disturbed evidence. The passage of time in that environment destroys information rapidly. So we're left with a gap. Labelle's account says one thing, the RCMP report says another, and neither can be fully verified. What adds another dimension to the Angikuni case is what other people in the region reported seeing around the same time. Multiple trappers and travelers working in the areas surrounding Angikuni Lake described seeing unusual lights in the sky in the days before and after the village was found empty. These weren't descriptions of the northern lights, which every person living in the region would have been deeply familiar with. These were described as concentrated, bright blue-white lights that moved with apparent purpose. One trapper described a single light that hovered over the lake for several minutes before accelerating straight upward and disappearing. Another described a series of lights moving in formation low over the water. These accounts came from people who did not know each other and who were working in different areas around the lake. Now, the skeptical response to these accounts is straightforward. The northern lights can be dramatic and can occasionally produce unusual visual effects. Atmospheric conditions in the Arctic can create mirages and light phenomena that look unfamiliar even to experienced observers. And human memory is unreliable, especially when it's being recalled months or years after the fact. All of that is true. But the consistency of the descriptions across independent witnesses is notable. These weren't vague reports of something weird in the sky. They were specific, detailed, and remarkably similar to each other. Whether the lights are connected to the village's disappearance is impossible to establish. But their presence in the historical record adds a layer to this story that is hard to ignore entirely. There is another source of information about Angikuni Lake that doesn't show up in RCMP files or newspaper articles, and that is the oral tradition of the Inuit communities in the surrounding region. Elders from neighboring communities spoke of Angikuni as a place with a particular spiritual character. The lake itself was regarded with a mixture of respect and caution. It was considered a place of power, but also a place of danger. There were stories passed down through generations of people who had gone to the lake and not returned, of strange sounds emanating from the water at night, of a presence associated with the lake that did not welcome visitors. These traditions predate the 1930 disappearance by a significant amount of time. They were not created after the fact to explain what happened to the village. They were already part of the cultural understanding of the landscape before Labelle ever arrived. In many Western investigations of anomalous events, indigenous oral traditions are dismissed as folklore or superstition. But these traditions represent centuries of accumulated observation by people who lived intimately with the land. When multiple generations of people who depend on precise knowledge of their environment for survival tell you that a particular place is dangerous, that carries a kind of empirical weight that shouldn't be casually discarded. The Inuit understanding of Angikuni Lake wasn't that it was haunted in the way a Western audience might imagine, with ghosts and supernatural horror. It was more nuanced than that. The lake was understood as a place where the boundary between the normal world and something else was thin. A place where the rules that governed everyday life didn't always apply. The Angikuni Lake case entered mainstream Western awareness, primarily through Frank Edwards, who wrote about it in his 1966 book, Stranger Than Science. Edwards was a popular writer who specialized in unexplained phenomena, and his retelling of the Angikuni story is the version most people encounter first. The problem is that Edwards was not a rigorous researcher. He was a storyteller. His version of the Angikuni disappearance includes details and dramatic flourishes that cannot be traced back to Labelle's original account or to the RCMP records. He amplified certain elements and may have invented others. This has given skeptics a powerful weapon against the case. They can point to Edwards and say, correctly, that much of what the public knows about Angikuni comes from an unreliable source. And that's a valid criticism. But here's what that argument misses. Edwards didn't create the case from nothing. Labelle's telegraph message to the RCMP existed before Edwards was born. The RCMP investigation, however flawed, happened. The reports from other trappers about unusual lights were recorded independently. Edwards embellished a story that already existed. He didn't fabricate one. The challenge is separating the original core of the case from the layers of embellishment that have been added over the decades. And that's genuinely difficult, because once a story enters popular culture, the original facts and the later additions become tangled together. In the 1990s, a Canadian journalist attempted to do exactly that. Strip away the embellishments and find the original truth of Angikuni. He traveled to the region. He interviewed descendants of people who had lived in the communities surrounding Angikuni Lake. He researched government records from the 1930s. He tried to trace Labelle's movements and verify as many details of the original account as possible. What he found was complicated. The dramatic version of the story, an entire thriving village vanishing in a single night, was almost certainly an exaggeration. The evidence suggested that the community at Angikuni had been declining for some time before Labelle's visit. Families had been leaving gradually, possibly due to changing caribou migration patterns, possibly due to pressure from the Canadian government's policies toward indigenous communities. But, and this is important, the journalist also found that the depopulation of Angikuni was not fully explained by gradual migration alone. There were people who had been at the village relatively recently before Labelle's arrival, who could not be accounted for. The timeline didn't quite add up, and the descriptions of the village's condition, the food left out, the dogs left tied, the clothing left behind, were consistent across enough sources to suggest that something unusual had happened, even if it wasn't the instantaneous mass disappearance that the popular version described. The journalist's conclusion was essentially that the truth was somewhere in the middle. Not a single dramatic vanishing, but also not a simple, fully explained gradual migration. Something happened at Angikuni that caused people to leave in a way that was abnormal, leaving behind things they wouldn't normally leave. And the full explanation for that has never been established. So where does that leave us? We have a village in one of the most remote places on Earth that was found empty under circumstances that don't fully make sense. We have food left uneaten, kayaks left unused, clothing left behind in an environment where clothing is survival. We have sled dogs left to starve, which contradicts every rational departure scenario. We have graves that were opened and bodies that were removed from permafrost. We have independent reports of strange lights in the sky around the same time. We have Inuit oral traditions stretching back generations that mark this place as spiritually dangerous. And we have an official investigation that was inadequate by any modern standard. The skeptic says it was gradual migration, combined with an unreliable witness and decades of embellishment. And that's possible, maybe even probable. But the skeptic still has to explain the dogs. The skeptic still has to explain the graves. The skeptic still has to reckon with the fact that people whose entire existence depended on their equipment and their animals walked away from both. an entire community built over generations to endure the worst conditions this planet can produce, emptied out and left behind everything they needed to live. And after more than 90 years of asking, we still don't have a complete answer for why. What do you think happened at Angikuni Lake? Tell me your theory in the comments. And if you're new here, subscribe, because we've got a lot more places like this to explore. I'll see you in the next one.